Hey gang, meant to roll this out when the Q&A dropped for the fatter pillar. Yeah, okay, fine, the ironclad, but I got sidetracked, as usual. Anyways, I feel like there's a discussion to be had about the futures of crafting and how it relates and doesn't relate to construction. So if that sounds good, let's get this. First off, let's go back in time and start where I meant to start this a couple months back, the ironclad. One of the things that started this conversation in my own head was two things. First, it was confirmed that the ironclad had a shop on board to, let's see, repair vehicles. So that was the first thing. The second thing was that people began jumping to the conclusions that the ironclad would also be able to be used as a constructor, that it would be able to make buildings or other complex things. Yeah. Well, those people could be correct, and if they are, I'll be pleasantly surprised. But while I think construction and crafting will have a lot in common, I'm pretty sure they're going to be two distinct loops, especially in the associated ships will be capable of. Now, let's get into what crafting is and probably isn't. This is also where things will get into wild speculation because it's totally possible CIG goes in a different way and just combines the two. But I don't think so, and this is my channel, so yeah, let loose the wild speculation. Let's start with crafting. Crafting is pretty well understood in games, so I won't go too far into this. Actually, I'm lying. This will probably be the bulk of this vid now that I think about it. So, there. At its heart, crafting is just taking something found in the world or in the verse and turning it into something else. Most games these days have some element of crafting in them, or at least most games that I play anyways. You find a few flowers, for example, you can craft them into a healing balm. You find some rocks and a stick, you can make an axe. In Star Citizen, at the moment, this is super limited, but it'll definitely be added to in the future. At the moment, only the Vulture and the Reclaimer have a crafting station where they take in RMC and can use that as the basis for making small, simple items like multi-tools. Huh. Well, okay, now that I think about it, a multi-tool isn't that simple, but you get what I'm saying. You have one thing, RMC, and you can turn it into something else, the multi-tool. Pretty much with just the press of a button and waiting a few seconds. Given where 3D printing is today, right now in the real world, that's not too much of a stretch. The question is exactly how complex will this loop get? I think ships like the Vulture and up to the Reclaimer, and probably vehicles like the Prospector and the Vulcan eventually, and most other industrial ships in that vein, will eventually have some kind of simple crafting on them. That's maybe not a given, but it's at least likely. But there's also a chance that CIG gives us an actual crafting loop, and that would mean ships that are dedicated crafters. And these ships would likely be able to craft more complex things, especially as you get up into the bigger ships in that loop. So how complex? Well, let's take a look at an extreme example. A lot of you probably know what this game is, as it seems to have a lot of crossover in the Star Citizen community. But in case you've never heard about it, this is Satisfactory. And if you like this channel and follow it a lot, you'll be hearing a lot more about this game in the nearest future, because 1.0, its live release basically, is dropping on September 10th, and I'll be doing a playthrough of that. If you've seen my Cyberpunk playthrough, and trust me, almost none of you have, but I'm not bitter anyways. Where was I? Right. If you saw the Cyberpunk playthrough, the Satisfactory one will be similar, edited down by quite a bit because knocking things out in Satisfactory takes quite a bit of time. And this is where I think CIG will go in a slightly dumbed down version of this. So what do I mean? Take this factory here. It produces supercomputers. Pretty cool, right? But let's pull back the curtain a little more and follow these here belts down into the deeper recesses of this factory. And forgive how dark it is, they rolled out a lighting pass, and I haven't gone through and updated all my factories, knowing that 1.0 is coming relatively soon. This build has something like 200 to 300 hours in it. Anyway, supercomputers are made by 4 simpler items: a couple regular computers, a couple AI limiters, 3 high-speed connectors, and 28 plastic to round it out. Simple, right? But where did those items come from, you didn't ask? Well, let me show you. And I swear I will tie this back into Star Citizen, because this illustrates something that I've been talking about for a while now. And this shows it in a way that I just haven't been able to actually say. So let me show you. So we follow this ramp down to the lower levels, and let's see what's going on. Don't worry, I won't go into all of those. Let's just follow one. So let's follow this one for computers. So to make a computer, you need 10 circuit boards, 9 cable, 18 plastic, and 52 screws. Just to keep this one relatively simple, let's just follow the screws back along this line. I'm using an alternate recipe here, so it's a little simpler than what you'll see if you start the game fresh. But here you can see that I can make 21 screws. And in order to make those 21 screws, I need 5 iron ingots. So let's see where those ingots come from. Turns out they come out of these here smelters, turning 1 iron ore into 1 ingot. So where does the iron come from? This miner, which is planted on an iron node. So you can see these chains start simple. If all you wanted to make was iron ingots, the process is pretty easy. You plop down a miner, feed the resulting ore into a smelter, and bam, you've got your ingots. But as the item gets more complicated, it requires more and more other items that themselves are complex. At its heart, this is what Star System, Quantum whatever, is trying to emulate. But more behind the scenes than satisfactory is, obviously. Miners go out and get the iron quartz, laranite, agricium, and so on. They mine those raw materials, they bring them to refineries or refinery ships. Those refineries then purify those items, basically turning them into ingots, for lack of a better explanation. Then those purified items, those ingots, need to be brought to the next link in the chain. Probably some sort of factory that will either turn that item into something slightly more complex or combine it with something else to make a complex item that way. And on up the chain it goes until you have something like a nav computer that goes into a Carrack, for example. So think about how complex that chain is, how integrated CIG is trying to make it, and then think about how complex something like a multi-tool really is. The frame of it is pretty simple, but it also has a battery. Think of all the things that have to go into the battery. And then it has some kind of projector system for all of those beams. You could see an advanced 3D printer being able to make the frame at least, but how is it making the projector out of what's basically just ship skin? Do I think that's something that'll stick? Maybe? But you see what I'm getting at here. You might be able to say, just for simplicity in the game, that a crafting station can do that. But in order to make more complex things, it'll probably need more materials to work from. So you might be able to craft a multi-tool, just the base tool itself, but the attachments might require more exotic materials to work, or a blueprint. Let's take it up a notch. Think about what it would take just to make a Moby glass. It has a plastic strap, maybe some sort of metal or plastic or plasteel or whatever casing, a glass or plastic view screen, and inside of it is an actual computer. So this is why I landed this one in the wild speculation territory. We don't know how far CIG will push this. Will they keep it relatively simple, or will they make it more complex like Satisfactory does, requiring a whole mess of different materials and items to make progressively more complicated things? I mean, really, When has CIG ever gone the simple route? Still, basic crafting for basic things like the multi-tool, I think they'll keep it relatively simple and have it relatively widely available. So things like that will probably stick on ships like the Vulture and the Vulcan, with ships like the Reclaimer and the Carrack probably able to make more complex things, provided they have the requisite parts and materials. So not as complicated as Satisfactory, but more complex than a Star Trek style computer, give me a medium rare steak and 5 phasers. With that in mind, let's talk about the Ironclad. So the Ironclad will have a repair facility. Again, I've been hearing a lot of other content creators going on wild speculations of their own on this one, talking about people being able to pump out vehicles or buildings. My take? Absolutely not. I'm not even sure you'll be able to actually craft a vehicle component, although I would think you'd be able to repair even an extremely damaged one, provided you have the requisite materials on hand to do so. You'll also certainly be able to print off some armor, but if you want it to be high quality, you'll probably need better materials to start with. But anything truly complex, like a computer from scratch, yeah, that's probably out. So let's bounce up and scale a bit and look at the Pioneer. The Pioneer absolutely can print out whole buildings, but it also needs loads of material to do so, which they talked about during its concept sale. Those materials will probably include things like computers and other items that are pre-made, or if you can make them, they'll require their own materials specific to those complicated items. Again, I don't think it'll be as complicated as Satisfactory, but it doesn't need to be. For example, I could see a high-end big crafting machine just needing all the raw stuff. So the iron, the plastic, the copper, you get the idea. You just dump 1 SEU boxes of that into the hopper, and if the machine has the relevant blueprint, it'll be able to print out that thing. Who knows? CIG will probably have dedicated crafting ships that can create those things. It would make sense to have ships like that on the low end of the ladder, on the low end of that loop, with the Pioneer being on the top. The smallest ones can make tools. The medium ones can maybe make components. The larger ones can maybe make more complicated components. Maybe vehicles? Maybe. And then the Pioneer can flat out make a town for you if you have enough stuff. So that's where I'm landing on this whole thing. I think a few ships in specific loops, specifically mining and salvaging and probably repair, will have access to some sort of lower end crafting station that can do the basics. At least enough to repair badly broken things and get them running. But probably also make entirely new things, provided the facilities are a high enough tier and the right materials and components are loaded into the hopper. Actual crafting ships will be able to make more complex things at a smaller level because they're dedicated to that loop. You wouldn't want a Vulture to have a better crafter than the entry-level crafting ship, for example. I would think that the benefit might be preloaded in limited templates and blueprints versus crafting ships able to buy different blueprints and load them in. So more variety and agility. I think if I ran the zoo, that's how I'd balance it out. Finally, just since I've seen it come up a few times recently, especially with people doing the retrospective, what do we have from Sitcon so far episodes, let's talk about base building. So if you don't know, base building was mentioned at the tail end of Sitcon last year. And it was also mentioned that CIG was planning on bringing in everything in the Sitcon demos in the next year. That's this year, 2024. They quickly clarified, like within a week or two, that base building probably wouldn't be in our hands this year. Probably definitely wouldn't. But they would at least start working on it. Since the guy giving that demo was Todd Pappy, and he's no longer with CIG, it's hard to say if that stalled out the plans for this loop or not. But without making any guarantees or predictions on my part, or on the part of CIG for that matter, base building, at least the simple version, is pretty well understood in games. Even in MMOs with persistence, base building is pretty well understood. It's not something CIG has to make from scratch like it did with, say, Planet Tech or server meshing. That said, just given what I said about crafting, I fully expect the in-game product to be every bit as complicated as what I described before. But version 1, the first thing we get our hands on, probably just need to purchase a blueprint. They'll sell us some entry-level building making ship, or probably more likely that ground vehicle built on the Atlas chassis that they showed, and you'll load it with something generic. Call it RMC, or maybe even a couple materials. Just make it a little more complicated, like RMC construction material, maybe quartz, who knows? Something more complicated that'll probably be required by the blueprint. Actually, that would make a lot of sense. This blueprint requires these materials. You load in a few SCU boxes of material X, Y, and Z, and then out come the beams and it builds the building. That kind of basic tier 1 implementation sounds about right. I guess the real question would be is whether CIG will make it look like this, or this. My bet is probably more like 1 and 2, but what do you think? Let me know. It would even pull in different loops more than likely, and you'd likely need someone to salvage stuff and someone to mine stuff just to get the raw materials, or you could just buy it at a premium. So you can either work with other people and save money, but you'd have to pay them, or you could buy it from the store and probably pay a bit more. But that sort of thing sounds like it would be right up CIG's alley. Loops that produce things, and a loop that takes that product and makes something out of it. I think that kind of tier 1 implementation would be easy to pull off. The real question is where CIG prioritizes it, and where the teams are that would be working on that, or whether they even want to roll it out in that sort of a simple state or not. It's hard to say. Honestly, they could go a lot of different ways with this loop. Will we see it this year? I mean, probably not. Just given how much of the focus this year has been getting 3.2.3 out the door. And yeah, I know 3.2.4 is right around the corner, but it has features that were originally supposed to be dropping around March in 3.2.3. Turns out it was more complicated than they thought, which is kind of the MO of this project. Maybe base building will be the same, or maybe it'll be an easy win. Only time will tell. I do suspect that the team working on base building is the same one that's working on the UI elements, and probably the same team that's working on server meshing and that kind of stuff. So you can imagine how this is going to play out with those competing interests. And with that generous cop out, that's all I have for this one right now. Although stay tuned for that Satisfactory playthrough. You'll hear me say plenty in that one. Thanks for all the support, everybody. I've been blown away by it. Be good to one another. Catch me next time.